On January 8th, Deadline Hollywood reported that the director attached to the fourth Kelvin timeline Star Trek movie, S.J. Clarkson, had signed on to direct the pilot episode of HBO's Game of Thrones prequel series. The report also revealed that the reason she was able to do so was that Star Trek IV had been shelved, which is another way of saying that the fourth Star Trek movie is cancelled and no longer being pursued. For all intents and purposes, this implies that the Kelvin timeline is over. If you have seen our earlier coverage on Paramount's financial situation and the state of Star Trek, this should come as no surprise, as the writing has been on the wall for quite some time. However, since this news broke, there has been some level of finger-pointing on who or what is to blame for this state of affairs. Many outlets have pointed at the lead cast for reportedly demanding bigger paydays, or that the quote, successful Star Trek Discovery universe and ensemble characters was a bigger priority. Some even implied Disney's Star Wars has made Star Trek redundant. None of this is accurate. In this video, we will explore why Star Trek IV was planned and announced, just how badly Star Trek Beyond flopped at the box office and subsequently derailed those plans, before we explore what this might mean for the future of Star Trek on film. When Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto, and the remaining bridge crew were cast in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek reboot back in 2007, they signed only a 3-picture deal, meaning if any further Star Trek movies were made beyond the third, a new contract would have to be signed. Paramount and production company Bad Robot did not wait until after the release of the third movie, however. They locked down at least the most vital of the cast members prior to the third movie commencing production. On June 26 of 2015, 1 year after the release of Star Trek Into Darkness, but 1 year prior to the release of Star Trek Beyond, The Hollywood Reporter broke the scoop that Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto had indeed signed the option for a fourth Star Trek movie. Their price for doing so was a substantial increase in payment for Star Trek Beyond, which at the time was mere weeks away from beginning production, plus a better deal on the back end. As per the original 2007 contract, Chris Pine was set to be paid $3 million for Star Trek Beyond, but for agreeing to do a fourth Star Trek movie, his Star Trek Beyond paycheck was increased to $6 million. This contract would have stipulated exactly how much he would be paid for the fourth movie, should it be made, but that amount is unknown, although it presumably was much higher than the $6 million he ultimately was paid for Star Trek Beyond. While Star Trek Into Darkness did do better in international markets than the 2009 movie, it did not expand the franchise overall like the powers that be had hoped. The response to the film had also been significantly less favorable than they would have liked. Internal tracking numbers for Star Trek Beyond, which at this point was soon due for release, indicated that it would struggle at the domestic box office. But owing to the production deal Bad Robot had signed with Paramount, Star Trek was reportedly a very profitable endeavor for them regardless, as their fee was baked into the budget. As such, it was important for them to get investors excited and on board for a fourth movie prior to Beyond's release, and before any eroding investor confidence if it did underperform. To this end, Star Trek IV was formally announced on July 18th of 2016, and the return of Chris Hemsworth, the bit player in the 2009 movie that had since made a splash as Marvel's Thor, was highlighted. This announcement, choice of storyline, and the return of Chris Hemsworth was intended first and foremost to get potential investors on board, excited, and most importantly, to put their money into the next movie. The secondary purpose of the announcement was communicating to audiences that Star Trek is here to stay, and you don't want to be left out, so go see Beyond when it opens Friday. But above all, it was intended to retain investor interest, even in the case of Star Trek Beyond underperforming. But Beyond didn't just underperform, it outright bombed. For those not familiar with how the box office works, it may be tempting to Google the numbers, which says Star Trek Beyond had a listed production budget of $185 million and made $343 million worldwide, and therefore conclude it made more than its money back. So what's the problem? It is not quite that easy. For starters, the $185 million production cost is what the studio will admit to. The actual cost of actually making the movie will have been much, much higher. As we have previously reported, close to 1 year was spent developing one incarnation of a third Star Trek movie, spearheaded by Robert Orci. That was before it was scrapped in its entirety. Development of a third Star Trek movie then started over from scratch, under director Justin Lin and writer Simon Pegg. Under their watch, the movie was written, developed, filmed, and made ready for release in little more than a year and a half. A breakneck pace for a movie such as this. Those kinds of accelerated development costs and the money wasted on the previous incarnation of the movie, which led nowhere, were also expected to be recouped by Beyond. On top of that, Star Trek Beyond needed reshoots, rumored to have cost an additional $20 million on top of the $185 million production budget. The listed production budget also does not include the cost of marketing materials, buying airtime for advertisements, the promotional tour, and costs of actually putting the movies into theaters around the world, which allegedly came in at a cost that rivaled the listed production budget. Despite the listed production budget of $185 million, with all expenses included, the movie could have had a total negative somewhere upwards of $400 million that had to be recouped. The other end of the equation is the box office earnings. The studio does not get to keep that total worldwide gross of $343 million. Instead, it is divided between the studio, the exhibitors, and the authorities of all countries the movie is released in, which also take a cut in various taxes and other fees. How much the studio is left with depends which agreements they have with all of these parties, which varies from territory to territory. Only the studio's marketing department knows the exact amounts. As a general rule of thumb, the studio is left with on average 2/3 of the domestic gross. And due to the growth of the Chinese market, which leaves the studio with a fraction, unless production agreements say otherwise, less than half of the international gross. For Star Trek Beyond, this means that the studio lost somewhere between $150 million and $200 million plus on the endeavor. In terms of the number of audience members who actually went to see the movie, more people internationally saw Star Trek than has ever seen a Star Trek movie before. Domestically, the franchise was back to the days of The Undiscovered Country and Star Trek First Contact. But those movies only cost a fraction of what Beyond cost to produce. So unlike Beyond, they were highly successful at those levels. For Paramount, Star Trek Beyond's performance was disastrous. The movie, which they hoped would be their biggest of the year, was among their biggest flops in a year filled with them. Paramount's earnings were so bad that the Shanghai Film Group and Hua Hua Media walked out on the $1 billion co-funding agreement Paramount had celebrated in the press when it was signed. Regardless of the offering teased with Star Trek IV, the movie had lost its primary source of funding. Money would have to be found elsewhere. With both Paramount and Star Trek's recent track record, that was easier said than done. In the end, however, Paramount, Skydance, and Bad Robot were able to scrape together in the vicinity of $80 million that the movie could be made for. This came from other undisclosed funding partners that had not been burned by Beyond or other Paramount failures. These investors reportedly were won over by the promise of the same selling points as before: Thor in a Star Trek movie, a female director to score brownie points with the woke media, and above all, a medium budget, which meant that even the kind of box office numbers Beyond saw would be sufficient enough for the movie to be profitable. There was, however, one problem, and it was an expensive one. The agreements Bad Robot, Skydance, and Paramount signed with Hemsworth, Pine, and Quinto back in 2015 all assumed Star Trek IV would still get the massive blockbuster treatment, even more so than Beyond. That was no longer the case. Instead, they had to renege on their prior agreements and ask the stars to take payment cuts which reflected the budget now available. This was when Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pine walked. While there were media articles proclaiming Star Trek didn't need Kirk, there were bigger problems than that behind the scenes. Although not widely reported, we have been told by insiders with knowledge of the situation that other key cast members dropped out as well. This led to investors that were getting cold feet and withdrawing their support. Despite the best efforts of everyone involved, no further funding could be found to make up for this, and Star Trek IV ended up scrapped. Tempting as it may be to blame the actors for not agreeing to do the movie even if they wouldn't be paid what they were promised 3 years earlier, they are not to blame for the fact that the studio didn't have the money to fulfill their end of the bargain. The responsibility lies with Paramount for managing all of their movies so poorly that their investors walked out on them, and with Paramount for mismanaging the Star Trek brand to the point where Beyond flopped. Finger-pointing aside, the question now is, what comes next? Another in-development Star Trek movie that has gotten a lot of press coverage is Quentin Tarantino's Star Trek. With Star Trek IV and the Kelvin timeline done for, it may be tempting to think that Paramount will simply move that into production instead. However, the problem still remains. Paramount's sources of funding have dried up, and the financial backers they do have left will be very reluctant about putting more funds towards any Star Trek movie given the brand's recent history. To add even more pressure, the rights reversal deadline is looming on the horizon. Ever since the Viacom split in 2005, Paramount no longer owns Star Trek. Instead, they have licensed it from CBS, which are the owners of Star Trek. The terms of this licensing deal state that not only must Paramount's alternate Star Trek differ from the original Star Trek by a factor rumored to be 25%, but also unless that a new movie is in production by a stated time frame, Paramount's Star Trek license will be forfeit and revert to CBS. Unless Paramount and Bad Robot can secure the necessary funding for either the Tarantino Trek or any other Trek they can conjure, there will be no more Star Trek movies in the foreseeable future. What might change all of this, though, is a possible remerger between Paramount's parent company Viacom and the CBS Corporation. Join us for our next video where we will not only explore the Viacom-CBS situation, but how it directly led to both the Kelvin timeline and Star Trek Discovery, as well as why both of them are made under Paramount's alternate license, and why and how both of them, as well as the upcoming Picard series, are required to be different from the original Star Trek. Till then, let us know your thoughts on who is to blame for Star Trek's misfortunes in the comments below. If you like this video, then please click the subscribe button, and don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified for all the latest uploaded content. Due to recent changes to YouTube's monetization policies, we'd also like to ask you to please consider supporting Midnight's Edge and its sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark through Patreon. As thanks for their support, patrons will receive early notifications of mini-documentaries, special behind-the-scenes making of the Edge videos, bloopers, outtakes, lost episodes, and more. You can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. Be sure to check back for news and analysis on the corporate politics behind your favorite genre movies, as well as updates and discussion here at Midnight's Edge.